Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today as we talk about 3 math actions to raise student achievement. This is definitely something that a lot of folks are talking about as we're starting to see our math. For some of us, we're starting to see it take a slow decline. Some of us have been struggling to get it up. And there's a lot of things that we can do in a math classroom, but what are those real essentials that it takes? What are the key movements that we should see in math classrooms every day that's going to make a difference and really start to turn our student achievement around math towards that upward movement? So as we're talking today, we want to first think about what happened to math? What's different about math? So as we see the traditional math practices that we saw and the way that math was traditionally operationalized within curriculum and in classrooms, topics were covered by every grade level, every topic, every grade level. There was a lot of content to be covered. I mean, I remember working with teachers before the college and career standards came out. Teachers were always talking to me in math. We have a day per standard and skills. And so we have to keep moving. We don't have time. If our kids don't get it, we have to keep moving anyway. And so this was a real issue before the college and career standards came out. Topics were taught in isolation. There was no connection to what was being taught from what was learned previous years. So basically, it was that whole mile-long and inch-deep curriculum that we were looking at in math. And so once college and career came out, 2 things happened that came about in the college and career standards that changed all of that. And one was focus, where we have fewer topics, fewer concepts, which enables us to prioritize and deepen learning to make sure that we're going deep and not just touching on content. Also, it allowed us, with the architecture of the college and career standards, we're able to leverage learning with coherence, which is linking those topics not just across or within a grade, but across grades. So we don't need to teach our standards anymore as if it's the first time that students are seeing it, as if it's a new standard. We're able to build on what was previously learned. And also, another aspect of traditional math practices was how we taught it. Each problem, it had an answer and one way of solving it. And of course, with the college and career, we've now introduced rigor, which there should be a balance between what we see in classrooms of conceptual understanding, procedural skills, and fluency and application. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about rigor today because it's such a critical aspect to one of these actions that we should be seeing in classrooms all the time. And of course, the standards for mathematical practices came out, which is really for students. It's the tools for students to reason how they're supposed to reason about math. So we're going to talk more about these things as we go through the webinar today and our learning. So as I said, today we're going to spend quite a bit of time on rigor and really understanding the importance of that in these 3 actions to raise student achievement. So as we're looking at the shifts, we talk about the shifts so much. And what we've learned is that the shifts out in the field have a lot of different meanings to a lot of people. In some districts, we use shifts as if it's about any change that we're asking to happen. And while that is an accurate meaning, what we're talking about in this meeting today is about these shifts. So I like to say these shifts because it's the ones that are the instructional shifts that go with the math standards. So as we're looking at math core actions, and we're talking about these important core actions that have to do with math, it comes down to 3 things that we want to see. And what we've seen and implemented in classrooms is that there truly is a lack of these things being in the classrooms, which is that correlation to why we're not seeing our math scores go up more than what we anticipate, the student achievement go up more. So we can see core action 1, as you'll notice is the first column to the left here, is around core action 1. We do see more of that in classrooms, but I want to remind you that the scale that we're looking at, a 1 means that we didn't see it. So a 1 is a 0. So you can see that these 3 core actions that we're going to talk about today are almost non-existent in classrooms. And this data comes from several districts across America and many different types of districts, many different students that we're looking at. But we're overall not seeing these things being implemented in the classroom, these core actions. But what we found is after 1 to 2 months of working with teachers and helping them understand what these are, working with the curriculum office to get some of these things in place, we see an immediate increase in these classrooms. And this is with only 1 or 2 months. Now, with further support and with further learning, we see this go up even more. So one of the things where this comes from, these core actions come from a tool that is called the Instructional Practice Guide. Eric, if you want, there you go. It's the Instructional Practice Guide. And the Instructional Practice Guide comes from Achieve the Core, or Student Achievement Partners. And this is so practical information to help you implement this within your school or district. It's organized around these 3 core actions, which encompass the shifts. So those shifts are embedded in there. But it's more than the shifts. It really gives you the teacher and student evidences or behaviors that really exemplify those college and career standards. This tool can be used for planning, reflection, and also working together with peers and for coaches to use as well. So let's delve into those core actions. Let's start with core action 1. And core action 1 ensures the work of the lesson reflects the shifts required. So this is where the shifts begin to be a part of this. If you look at that first indicator, it's really about focus. So the enacted lesson is going to focus on the work of that grade level. The second indicator talks about coherence, which is where we relate new content of math to math within and across grades. And finally, that aspect of rigor. We're going to talk a lot about the aspect of rigor today. I wish we had more time today, but we will spend the majority of our time on that very important aspect of rigor. Go ahead, Eric. So let's start with focus. And like I said, many of you have had trainings around this, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through focus and coherence, and then we're going to spend a little time on the aspects of rigor. So focus truly is about the enacted lesson is focused on the right content. So the word, it's, I love the definition, focus strongly where the standards focus. So we do what the standards tell us to do. Sounds easy, right? But what we see is that a lot of time we're spending more time on either standards that are not the major work of the grade, supporting standards, additional standards, versus the standards that we should be focused on. And because of this, it should allow us to move away from teaching each standard equally as important, but that we understand which ones are the most important and the ones that we want to focus on and spend most of our time. So as we go to the next slide, Eric. So this is a picture of, if you see at the top, the first table is what the what content for math used to look like. We would see the same for pre-K to 12, the same concepts, the same domains that were focused on within each grade level. But as the table on the bottom shows us, that as we implemented the college and career standards, it really does show us the pathway, especially for K to 8, that it outlines the major standards, the supporting standards, and the additional clusters for each grade. This shows for grade 4 that cluster level alignment. You can see in grade 4 where you're seeing all those domains that are going to be taught in 4th grade. You can look at kindergarten and see what's going to be taught in kindergarten. So all the standards are important, but the emphasis, labels, help a teacher know what is most important and which ideas support a deep conceptual understanding of the most important ideas and which are setting the groundwork for future math concepts. And this is really critical to the structure of the standards. So what we can see from this quote, in high school, it's a little bit different. It's not about, separating the domains and separating the techniques, but that you're seeing that overall structure that ties all of these ideas together. So focus does look a little bit different in high school, and as they bring all those concepts together that they've been learning. And one thing that we talk about and we'll talk about in coherence a little bit more, how in math all roads lead to algebra as the starting point for high school. So we'll, as we look at coherence, we'll look a little bit more in that. And I believe at this time, Eric, we're going to be doing an audience poll.
That's correct. I've got your first poll question here. So I'm going to share the poll question and read it, and feel free to engage and give us your feedback. So the question is, as a district or school, has your curriculum identified the following to focus on the major work of the grade? Options are major clusters, supporting clusters, additional clusters, all of the above, or none of the above. So if you would, give this some thought and give us your feedback. We'll keep the poll open for a few more seconds here. Okay, looks like we're pretty close to being done. And I'm sharing the results now. Let's see. Looks like 30% said major clusters, 50% Carla said all of the above, and 20% said none of the above.
Yeah, and if we're not doing this, we're really missing the opportunity to leverage the standards, because 65% and up to approximately 85% of class time should be devoted to the major work of the grade. And when I give you that 65 to 85, really for K2, should be that upper end of the range. Devoted to the major work of the grade. And of course, that focus, meaning that they're significantly narrowing the scope of content in each grade so that students achieve at higher levels, and so the students are able to experience more deeply what they're supposed to be focused on. So if you haven't done this work in your district, I mean, that is definitely the recommendation, that those major clusters are identified, the supporting and the additional, so we all know what's important. So the all of the above is what needs to be identified for all teachers in the district. If you haven't done that work, I'm just going to say we love to do this work, and we have some real math experts that are happy to help you do that. So that's all I'm going to say and throw out there about that. All right, let's go to talking about coherence. This is where the lesson relates new content to math content within or across grade levels. And I think that's such an important point to make, that it's not just within the math level, not just the grade level, but actually across grade levels. So because there's these two types of coherence, and those are the two: connecting topics within a given grade and connecting that learning across grades. Both of these enhance students' understanding of mathematical concepts, and the organization of the standards themselves build on the previous learning, sometimes explicitly in the language of the cluster headings. Teachers need to be able to really count on the conceptual understanding of core content and build on it. And so this is where we can sometimes really miss this great opportunity if we're not utilizing the coherence. That's the architecture of the standards. We're missing this great opportunity if we don't do that. So on the next slide, we're going to show you this all roads lead to algebra in K8. And this is where the coherence, and this comes from Achieve the Core. If you haven't seen this document, you're not familiar with it, it is so helpful that you're able to see this progression from kindergarten through 8th grade. And you can see how we build on the knowledge starting in kindergarten, and then how these connect across the grade levels. So, and it doesn't always mean that it's going grade level to grade level. It might mean that something is being worked on conceptually in grade 1, and we may not build that procedural knowledge until grade 3. There are some examples of that within the standards. Let me show you what coherence for addition and subtraction look like in grades K to 4. So go ahead and there we go. So now you can see that in kindergarten for addition and subtraction, we're going to work in grades kindergarten within 5, and then within 10 we'll start to do as well because we're doing up to 5. So this shows that coherence and how we build on that knowledge. And what this is supposed to do for us in the standards is ensure that we're not treating each standard as it's the first time that it's being introduced. So we have to understand what the coherence is and label that for teachers so that they can leverage that in their lessons and talk about and make those connections for students. And I think we're going to another poll now.
Right, so the second poll that we have is a pretty short and simple one, so I'll give it to you now. As a district or school, has your curriculum identified for teachers points of coherence? As a district or school, has your curriculum identified for teachers points of coherence? All right, we'll close this up here in a few seconds. Okay, Carla, it looks like we're at split skis there. So 50% yes, and that leaves 50% no.
Right. So, you know, one thing to know, and I know that we, I believe we have teachers and leaders attending the webinar today. So for teachers, imagine that being identified for you so that in your curriculum, you can see, hey, this lesson is going to connect to this previous learning, even in the grade level or possibly in a grade before you, where students had that opportunity to learn it and the context of that, so that you can bring that in, leverage that within your lesson. If we're not doing that, it's a great loss, and you're really losing that benefit that's built into the standards for you. We don't want to treat each standard as it's the first time students are exposed unless we know that's the case, which the coherence would help us understand that. That students are exposed and introducing instead of relating to what was previously learned. We're losing ground and probably working harder than we need to. It's built in there for us, and we want to make sure that we're leveraging that as we're instructing. So now we're going to move to this big topic of the aspects of rigor. Now, this is the secret sauce for college and career mathematical standards. And if you're not familiar with the aspects of rigor, again, this word rigor goes around in a lot of different meanings, just like shifts, right? So what it talks about in math, it's very specific in math. So the standards require this balance of conceptual, understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and application, and that we should be treating these equally as far as our lessons and as far as implementation in the classrooms. So let's take a look at what this looks like a little bit more. We are going to go deep into this today. So as we look at what is rigor, have you heard that word in your district? I know it's all around, and I've seen districts with very large definitions of rigor. But what we want to think about in math is it's this deep, authentic command for mathematical concepts. And so it's not making math harder, but it's actually helping our students because we're not introducing topics in isolation, but they're connected together. So it's a way to help students meet the standards. It also helps educators tremendously by understanding when they need to use these aspects of rigor in the classroom. And of course, when it comes down to rigor, we're really looking at what's the level of complexity and how much autonomy is needed by the students as well. So there's 3 aspects of rigor, as we said: conceptual, understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and real-world application. So let's start with conceptual understanding. So as we look at conceptual understanding, this is where we teach more than how to just get the answer. Eric, if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide. There we go. This is the ability to teach more than how to just get the answer. We want to go beyond that. This is more than a set of mnemonics or discrete procedures. So if you think back to the beginning slide where we talked about traditional math instruction, when we bring this aspect of rigor into the classroom, it's the ability for students, ability to access concepts from multiple perspectives. When students are proficient, they begin to understand why a mathematical idea is important and all the kinds of context in which it's useful. They've organized their knowledge into a coherent whole, and this enables them to learn new ideas by connecting those ideas to what they already know. Conceptual understanding also supports retention because facts and methods learned with understanding are connected. They are easier to remember and use, and they can be reconstructed when forgotten. So conceptual understanding, and let's look at procedural understanding. So the procedural understanding, the standards themselves, they call for speed and accuracy when students are calculating. And the ultimate goal for fluency is to get students to know facts from memory and perform computation quickly and accurately, but the process of getting students there is not absent of understanding. This is the outcome of a carefully laid out learning progression, which is it's inherent in the standards, and it's a strategic progression of learning. That means students are not expected to develop a procedural fluency without first developing a deep conceptual understanding. Now, that was a real critical statement there. And I'm going to show you something after we go through these three aspects of rigor that I think will make a little bit more sense with what I just talked about. It's just procedural skill and fluency is just as important as conceptual understanding. Too much practice too soon can be ineffective, and it can really lead to that math anxiety that we've seen all those videos about the college and career standards that are causing stress at home based on that. So let's talk about application, and then we're going to put it all together for you. So this is that real world application. Students are going to be using appropriate concepts and procedures for application. So are you starting to see how it builds on each other? So we have to start with the conceptual understanding, and then we move to the procedural knowledge, and then we move to application. And there should be a balance of these. So really, it's almost easier to understand application, to understand what it's not. It's not having students complete a word problem or two at the end of a lesson or chapter. Students need true opportunities to grapple and make sense of problems and identify a solution pathway for themselves so that they're able to do that. Students need to have opportunities with real world applications that require the students to determine on their own, which skills do I need to use? What concepts do I need to draw on? What are the mathematical tools that I need to use here? They can and should apply these skills to tackle the problem at hand. I mean, if you think about it, this is really why we learn math, right? We learn it so we can apply it in situations that require mathematical knowledge. And so that leads us to our next point, which is, where do we start? I mean, it's conceptual. We want to start with that conceptual understanding and then build to procedural, but there's more. It also goes back and forth. It's a process. So we introduce the conceptual understanding, and then we move to the procedural once we've had them encounter that conceptual understanding. But as we're working on the procedural, sometimes we find errors or misconceptions around the conceptual understanding, and so we have to go back to conceptual and make sure we strengthen that. And once we see maybe some gaps in the learning there. So let's see what happens when we add application into the process. So we're still going to start with conceptual, then we build to building that procedural knowledge, and then finally we're ready to go to the application once we've built this. But the same idea applies here. Even though we start with conceptual, go to procedural and application, it cycles back So once our students are engaging with application problems, we may see, I thought they understood had the conceptual understanding, but now that the context may have changed, now that we're putting it in a different frame, a real world application, we could very well see that they didn't have it as much as we thought they did. So this is where we would want to go back and work on conceptual. Maybe we'll see, well, they're not as fluent and they haven't developed as much fluency as I thought they had in procedural. So we need to go do a little bit more practice for that. So it works great together. It is that three-legged stool that we see often represented around the college and career standards. Let's do a poll. I want to see what you see most. I want you to think about, and Eric, I know you're coming on, but as you're walking in classrooms, which aspect of rigor do you use as a teacher? If you're a teacher, what are you using the most? And if you're an administrator, principal leader, what do you see the most when you're walking classrooms?
Okay, so we've launched this third poll. So give this some thought. Which aspect of rigor do you use or do you see the most? Conceptual, procedural, or application? We'll keep this short question open for a few more seconds. Okay. And, well, it looks like procedural is taking about 89% of the responses, Carla.
And that is true. And that's why I said to you much earlier that this truly becomes the secret sauce for the standards. So, the question becomes, which aspect of rigor do you use as a teacher, or do you see as an administrator the most in your role? So, do you see conceptual, procedural, or application? And of course, predominantly, as I'm walking classrooms, I walk across the nation doing needs assessments in curriculum, and I look to see what's being implemented. We look to see what's being implemented. And what we see over and over is that predominantly we're only seeing procedural. We very rarely do I see, before we start working with a district, anything other than procedural skill. And that's K to 12. I can't tell you, oh yeah, well, we see that in elementary, but we don't see it in secondary. It's K to 12 that we see the focus is on procedural skill. And as we talked about today, there should be a balance. We should see equal intensity in time, activity, and resources. So I can't stress enough to you today of the secret sauce of the aspect of rigor, and understanding that when you can recognize from the standard, with even a learning target, what is my focus today? Is this standard telling me to focus on conceptual, real world, or procedural? And then that should drive what strategies and practices that I'm going to use in my classroom. So regardless, even you'll see in standards, oftentimes you will see it will tell you, but it's predominantly one aspect of rigor, but you will see sometimes two and sometimes three within one standard. So obviously, if we have this in the indicator showing that I need to cover all three aspects of rigor, that becomes a really big topic that my students are going to be entering into to really understand the conceptual, procedural, and real world application within a single time. So as we're talking about the aspect of rigor, how do you know which one to use the most? The balance is built into the progression of the standards. So when you think about the standards tell you which aspect of rigor to use. Now, sometimes there's one aspect of rigor in a standard, sometimes there's two, and sometimes there are three. But there is a balance throughout all the standards for every grade level of how often we should be doing this. So regardless, as you're walking classrooms in your school, you should see this balance. And of course, predominantly as I'm talking to administrators, to district office, and to teachers, I ask them, which aspect of rigor do you use the most? Almost every time people are telling me, I'm sorry, not almost, every single time I've asked that question, people are telling me they're predominantly using the practicing. And so we want to make sure that we start to look at standards and understand which aspects of rigor we should be focusing on. So some key questions to ask about this particular thought on core action 1. you want to ask, are units targeting the major work of the grade? Do units target the supporting work of the grade? So you want to make sure that we don't ignore the supporting work. I've been in districts and worked with districts where they have decided, well, we want to spend all of our time on the major work, and so therefore we're not going to teach the supporting. And I will tell you, your students will lack a very weak foundation if they're not allowed to learn the supporting work of the grade. It really does strengthen the major work of the grade. So how does this lesson fit within a unit? One of the things that we always want to ask teachers, and we want to ask coaches as we're walking schools, talk to me about the unit and help me see that progression and the sequence of learning within the unit. I think we have a question for that as well here. And then which of the three aspects of rigor are attended to within this unit? If more than one is attended to, when in the unit are they attended to individually? These are really good questions to ask teachers, because it's important that they can explain this and understand that rationale behind the units that they're implementing. And then this goes back to that sequence. How are the lessons and tasks sequence to help students develop that increasingly sophisticated understanding of skills and practices? So I really encourage you to use these questions as you're out in the field and working with folks. If you have trouble answering these questions, give us a call. We'd be happy to work with you to help you understand how that works together. So then we have core action 2. Let's go into core action 2. And core action 2 is about the instructional practices and approaches that are happening in the classroom. So as we look at those, what the core action and the indicators look like, and I tell you, if you're a teacher and you're seeing these behaviors of a teacher, it really does tell you what you should be doing in the classroom every day, all the time. If you're a school leader and you're going into classrooms, these are the things that you want to see your teachers doing in the classroom. So it really does reframe and shape our instructional vision now for what that quality looks like in the classroom. Teachers are making, the mathematics of the lessons explicit through the use of explanations, representations, tasks, and examples. So it tells you exactly what type of instruction you should be seeing. Are they using other students' work in a strategic way to help them see the other ways that students are problem solving so that they learn from each other? The teacher is checking for understanding throughout the lesson, and looking for those misconceptions that students might be having right in the lesson, and they're looking for opportunities for students for growth and adapts the lesson according to what they're seeing right in the moment. So this is a true definition of formative assessment, right? This is what we want to see the teachers doing, that very effective use of looking for, not waiting till the end of the lesson after they've maybe gone home and practiced it wrong overnight, but that we're seeing those misconceptions and errors happening within the classroom and correcting them right there, allowing the students to then practice that while we're still in the classroom, and we can see if they did get a solid understanding or if they need some more work in that area. And that, so you get the feel for the behaviors that you're seeing here, that this could be messy, right? Students are trying things out. The teacher's using mistakes and accuracies to help deepen students' learning. But at the end of the lesson every day, the teacher really takes that moment to summarize what we've learned today, what we've seen today, references and shows students' work, talks about ahas, talks about discussions that have happened among students. So this type of classroom that we're looking for is students talking to each other, learning from each other within the classroom. So basically, the teacher actions are built right into those core actions, stating what the teacher should be doing. But core action 3 is going to really focus on putting together teacher action and student action together. So core action 2, some of those key questions. How are students sharing their strategies and thinking? Do you see that students have that place, that the teacher is providing a safe place, really, for students to share not just one way of solving the problem, but multiple ways of solving the problems? Are students' misconceptions addressed with peers, or is the teacher the one who is addressing those misconceptions? The teacher has to plan it, teach the structures for students to be able to know how to share those misconceptions with their peers. But we want to see the students having those conversations. Our lessons, do you see that summary happening at the end of the lesson? You see students reflecting what they thought they knew and what they know now, and what questions they still have. So these are the behaviors that we're looking for out of core action 2 that we should be seeing in every lesson. So now we get to core action 3, which is it is a big core action, but it is a very powerful one. And this is where we can see, as you will notice on the left side of the screen, all the things that the teacher does so that students will do the things on the right. So we're connecting those together. So let's look at this first one. The teacher provides opportunities for all students to work with and practice grade or course level problems and exercises so that students work with and practice grade or course level problems and exercises. So we want to see the students doing the work. We want to see the teacher providing those opportunities for students to be able to do it. We want to see students persevering, and we'll show you on this next slide, really looking at what we're looking for students to do. So we talk a lot in education today about social and emotional learning and equity and access. Core Action 3 is where equity and access lives. This is how we're helping all students to have that access to grade level work in math by putting them together with their peers and having these conversations and learning and working together. And we see the social and emotional learning really come into play during Core Action 3 as students are able to problem solve and they're able to meet their goals that they've established. This is where we truly start to see that. So the student actions that we see in Core Action 3, the students are solving the problems. I can't emphasize the word students enough here. We want to see them solving the problems, and the teacher is listening how they're solving, listening for those misconceptions and also accuracies in their thinking. Students are sharing their thinking and they're really sharing it with peers. They explain their thinking with their peers and also, to their class. Students talk and ask questions about each other's thinking. So what we want to see are these conversations happening with students, very rich, so that if we follow that architecture of the standards, we're able to get students to the depth that we're asking of them so that they're able to have the deeper conversations so that they can talk and ask questions, and the teacher is taking those notes again to understand what their students, where they're at in their learning, and that students are using precise language in their explanations and discussions. So if there's academic language in there for math, we would expect to hear it at this point. So the key questions to ask for Core Action 3 are pretty powerful, right? In what ways have you seen your students increase their independence? So are you starting to see them become confident and more competent as they're solving the math problems that they're working with? Do you see them growing in their conceptual understanding? Do you see them growing in their fluency? Do you see them growing in their ability to solve problems? Which standards do students still need to develop? How can you support them in doing so? And it's important in that teachers and administrators, that they help their teachers be able to keep track of how their students are progressing towards the standards, because the students are continually learning. And especially with coherence, as we go back to standards and connect them together within the grades, and of course across grades, but within the grade levels, we can see students grow within the year. What tools are appropriate for students to independently access? And this goes, really looking at those mathematical standards for mathematical practice. How are we using those within the unit? And then do students frequently choose and use appropriate tools strategically in class? Again, utilizing those mathematical standards for practice, that we can see students using that within their class. So as we think about our work and these 3 core actions, it comes down to this quote from Richard Elmore that says, we really need to increase the level and knowledge of skill. So if your teachers have not had the opportunity to learn these 3 core actions and be coached and have that opportunity for a coach to coach them in the classroom as they're implementing that needs to become a focus to leaders, that they're helping to develop this knowledge and skill of teachers. And then we need to increase the level and complexity of the content that our students are engaged in. And this happens through this work by looking at the standards and understanding what's that aspect of rigor. What does rigor mean today in my classroom? And that's where we look at the 3 aspects. And that we change the role of the student in the instructional process. And as we went through these 3 core actions today, you could see how they build on each other. We start with core action 1, then we build to 2, and then we build to 3. Once we get into core action 2 and 3, we can see the role of the student changing, where we want to see more and more student evidence, students doing the talking, students explaining to each other. And so they become their experts to each other, instead of the teacher always being the one to rescue and kind of rob students of their learning as they're explaining things to them. So as we're finishing up today, today I hope we brought some new learning to you, some new thinking around math implementation in your schools. And so I think about Maya Angelou, who said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Sometimes we hold on to the way that we've been doing things because we put a lot of sweat equity into creating that. We don't want to do that, right? We want to be able to let go because it's all about our students. And especially if you want to see the change in student achievement, if you want to see students achieving more and more, this is the work that you want to focus your math teachers on. And we would be happy to help you do that.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Thanks, Carla. The strategies that Carla outlined are part of LSI's Innovative Professional Development Series that is really trying to help districts create standards-driven units. And her team, as you can tell just by these past 2 webinars that we've done, really spend a lot of time working through the nuances of helping districts align to their state standards. So each of these training opportunities are ideal for curriculum staff, coaches, and teachers. We'd love to be able to come out and help you if you feel like there's a connection there. You can learn more about what we have available in this regard at learningsciences.com/curriculum. Pretty simple. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our incredibly popular conference, Building Expertise, which happens every June. This year, we're focusing on social and emotional learning, rigor, to Carla's point, and the importance of student academic teams. And with that kind of focus, we've got the best keynote speakers lined up. Dr. David Sousa, he's an educational neuroscience author. And then, of course, Dr. Robert Marzano, they lead our keynote speaker list. And this year, we're bringing in a futurist. And if you've never heard of futurist, I think you'll be amazed. Erica Orange is her name, and she's just incredible. And then, of course, we have Kenny Thomas, who he's a combat veteran, part of the Black Hawk Down experience. He's going to be talking about the importance of team, and I know he's going to have some really good insight on his experience with the power of team, and then how we can apply that as experts in the education industry. So you can learn more about this conference, which is next June 12 through 14 in Orlando at Disney. You can learn more at buildingexpertise.com.